Hi, I'm Max Planer, and let me tell you why didn't the Allies capture Berlin. In April 1945, American and British forces were deep inside Germany. The Nazi army was collapsing, and Berlin was under constant bombing. The war was clearly reaching to its end. So, here's the obvious question. If the Allies were already so close, why didn't they just take Berlin themselves? Why did the Britain and United States stop and let the Soviet Union capture the Nazi capital? Well, the answer isn't simple, and it has a very little to do with who could reach Berlin first. Let's look at spring 1945. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was finished in all but name. The Red Army was advancing rapidly from the east. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine and were pushing deep into Germany. German resistance was fragmented and desperate. On a map, it looked like a race. And if it were a race, many American generals believed that they could win it. In fact, US forces were closer to Berlin than many people realize. So, why did they stop? There's a myth as the Allies couldn't reach Berlin. Let's clear this up right away. The Western Allies could have reached Berlin. General Eisenhower knew this. General Patton definitely knew this and openly argued for it. So this was not a question of ability. It was a question of whether taking Berlin was worth the cost. And that cost would have been enormous. So, what Berlin really meant militarily? By April 1945, Berlin had lost most of its strategic value. It was no longer a major industrial hub, no longer a command center that could change the course of the war, and no longer necessary to defeat Germany military. So the German army was already collapsing everywhere else. From a purely military perspective, Berlin was not necessary, and it was purely symbolic. And in war, symbolism is usually the most expensive thing to fight for. So, Allied generals estimated that capturing Berlin could cost 100,000 casualties or more in intense urban combat against fanatical defenders, SS units, and desperate civilians. The Americans had already fought brutal city battles, like Aachen, and Berlin would be far worse. And here's the key question Allied leaders asked themselves. Why sacrifice 10,000s of soldiers for a city that wouldn't shorten the war, especially when someone else was already heading there? So the real answer is politics, not military power. This is where the real explanation begins. The fate of Berlin had effectively been decided months earlier, not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Allies agreed on occupation zones, post-war borders, and who would control which part of Germany. So Berlin was deep inside Soviet zone. No matter who captured it, Berlin was always going to be controlled by the Soviets. So, even if American troops had taken the city, they would have had to hand it over anyway. So, a decision needed to be done. General Dwight D. Eisenhower made the final call, and his reasoning was simple. Berlin was not worth the blood. Instead of pushing east, Eisenhower redirected the Allied forces southward to destroy remaining German armies, to prevent a potential lost stand in the Alps, and to end the war as quickly as possible. This decision saved lives, but it also shaped the post-war world in ways no one fully understood at that time. But there was a dissenter. Not everyone agreed. Winston Churchill was deeply concerned about Soviet intentions. He believed allowing the Red Army to take Berlin would strengthen Stalin's position in Europe. General Patton went even further. He openly argued that the Allies should race to Berlin, not to win the war, but to win the peace. But by 1945, strategic unity mattered more than individual ambition, and Eisenhower held firm. Let's look at the Soviet perspective. For the Soviet Union, Berlin was everything. It was revenge for years of devastation, a symbol of victory over Nazi Germany, and proof that the USSR was now a global superpower. Stalin was willing to pay any price for Berlin, and he did it. The Battle of Berlin cost the Soviets hundreds of thousands of casualties, but politically, it was worth it. Then what happened after Berlin fell? When Berlin fell in May 1945, the war in Europe was over. But something else began almost immediately. Germany was divided, Europe was split into spheres of influence, and Berlin itself became a symbol, not of victory, but of division. The Cold War didn't start years later. In many ways, it started the moment the Allies chose not to enter Berlin. So, was it the right decision? This is where history gets complicated. Militarily, yes, the decision made sense. Humanly, it saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. Politically, consequences were enormous. By avoiding Berlin, the Western Allies helped shape a world divided between East and West, a division that would last for decades. The Allies didn't stop short of Berlin because they were weak. They stopped because the war was already won and the next war was quietly beginning. Berlin wasn't just the end of World War II, it was the starting line of the Cold War. And sometimes the most important battles are the ones you choose not to fight. If you enjoyed this video, you can reward our efforts by giving a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. And please tell me in the comment section, do you think the Allies should have taken Berlin? Or was Eisenhower right? And last but not least, thank you for watching and see you in the next video.